but that's what code requires us to do for egress requirements. And I think that's where Scott was trying to help us out with some of the language there, and why some of those changes were being made. So quickly, one example we'll look at, let's say we have a school of about 1,500 students. That's the demographic reports that, hey, this school needs to support about 1,500 students. What we worked through with the district when we were setting up the programs for these schools, we said, okay, if we want to max out at 30 students, that means we need 50 classrooms. Well, Oklahoma City Schools, and I think everybody kind of understands this, smaller classroom sizes actually gives you better educational service. So it's kind of counterintuitive. We want smaller classrooms, but we're going to have to build for the max occupancy for a fully staffed or a fully occupied classroom. So what Oklahoma City Schools did, they wanted to say, hey, we want to target about 25 kids in the classroom, but we want to have a little bit of give in case that number needs to go up. So what we did is we said, okay, you're going to have 60 classrooms instead of 50. But now when you put in those 60 classrooms, what that does is it makes our code occupancy go up to 2520, where we're actually in a school that's supposed to serve about 1,500. So you can see kind of the offset that does with the storm shelter requirement. It starts to make the storm shelter much larger than it needs to be. So we've got 3 quick examples here, case studies. This is the proposed Capitol Hill High School. We were thinking kind of max occupancy would be around 2,500 as students and faculty. And if you look at that, the gym assembly space 1 is sized for about 3,400. The assembly space 2, which is the auditorium, is about 1,000. But code requirement, when you look at educational, vocational, and office, it says we've got to have, this school will hold 4,219 kids or people total, which is absolutely not the case. We were never intending for the school to hold that many, and honestly, it can't function at that number. So if we go by the actual school occupancy, the storm shelter is 169% oversized, whereas if we go with just the assembly space, the gymnasium, we're at 124% oversized from what we need to be. Those areas in red are just kind of where the planned storm shelters are now. The truth is, one of those storm shelters will actually hold, about one of those storm shelters will hold the actual occupancy for the school. So this is the John Marshall case that I was talking about. So it's a collection of separate buildings. And what we're planning on doing right now, the areas in red, the one towards the center of the complex, that's the current administration building. The one on the down and to the right, that's a classroom wing that we are going to convert to offices. The wing that comes towards the bottom of the page here is where we're going to have the secure entry vestibule. And then we're going to take that admin building and turn it into an education space. That triggers the change of use space in the existing building for the IEDC to education space, where was a business classification before. That would then trigger the requirement for a storm shelter that is for roughly about 2,575 students. The school will only hold about 1,350. Okay? So what that means is we've got a storm shelter that's going to be around 20,000 square feet, probably cost around 10 to 11 million. I think we projected 11.3 million there. And the original budget for the remodel, the school was 5.2 million. And that kind of gives you a representative size of how big that storm shelter would need to be to hold everybody here according to the code for the egress requirement. So this is another great example. Northwest Classen High School, we're putting an addition. The gray area that you see here is the addition. I should have said this before, but all the green spaces, those are education, office, and vocational classroom spaces. So when you look at it, this school can hold about 2,600 students, or total, about 2,370 students, and a staff of about 250. The assembly space doesn't approach that, or approaches that number, but it's not bigger than the classroom space. But code will tell us, and I ran all the code checks on this building, code will tell us that we need a shelter for 4,955 or 65 students or occupants, which is 199% oversized based on egress requirements for this building. That means that we're looking at an additional cost to the school of about $21 million, which which I don't think that's the intent anybody had with the change of use or change of occupancy, but that's kind of how that can trigger and hurt us on the project. So this was kind of a twofold example. One, we wanted to show kind of the impact of the change of use, but also kind of the egress occupancy issue versus the actual occupancy. Nobody is wanting to say, we don't want to protect kids. We want to have storm shelters for all the kids, and there's a way to get there. But don't make us build a storm shelter that's twice as big as it needs to be, is really kind of what we're after. And with that, kind of some of the things that we were wanting to suggest or think about, change of use. And this is what Scott actually has already done. He suggested that idea of, can we use language to exclude existing education buildings? So I think the intent of the code was, if you have a building that wasn't an educational building before, if it was an office space, mall, whatever, and it gets taken over as a school, that would trigger the building storm shelter, which that makes sense. But the way it was written, if we convert admin space and create a classroom out of it, or 2 classrooms out of it, that would also trigger a storm shelter because of the change of use or space language. So what Scott had brought to us is, can we exempt existing education buildings from this requirement, which makes a lot of sense.
If I can interject.
Yeah.
We got 2 Scotts in the room. When you say Scott?
Scott Weiss, yes,
okay.
yeah. Thanks for the clarification. I've always been referring to Scott Weiss, except for my first introduced Scott Randall behind us. But I'm glad you brought that up, Ezra.
So if we can, we need to kind of get back to the structure of this conversation here. If we want to start the conversation with any proposed amendments to the section 423 of the IBC, we want to do that discussion first.
Yeah.
I think you've kind of made all the points you wish to make, at least to begin with.
Try to be quick.
I don't know if there's any discussion. Anybody else who wants to chime in? Anybody from the public who wants to talk about the section 423 of the EU storm shelters? So no public comments.
So is the goal that existing schools don't need a storm shelter?
Absolutely not the goal.
So you're planning on having that in yours?
The goal is that for a change of use condition, that existing schools would be exempt from that. That way it allows them to come in and do remodels, improve the spaces, improve the classrooms, or like we're doing at John Marshall, swap out classrooms. We actually are not increasing or decreasing the occupancy in that school. We're just getting a more secure entry and then remodeling for the displaced classrooms.
Do any of the schools you're doing have storm shelters out of the renovation?
Yes, many of them do. We're not, honestly, we can't do it in every single school that needs one, but we are, I think we're improving 14 schools, I think, are getting storm shelters out of this. 60, well, we are, yeah.
By the end of the bill, we're gonna be at 61%.
Shelter, yeah.
By 2026.
Yes. All of the new schools are getting storm shelters, so that's not even a question we're asking on that. So we are making a significant improvement.
Yeah, the current language, even as proposed, would still require storm shelter facilities for any scenario. They would be, adding new square footage or building new schools. All of those would still be required.
And that was always the plan.
So for the Classen example, that's a new section.
It's getting a storm
shelter.
Yes.
The question is just, what's the occupancy?
Right.
So, that's, because it's at least two questions we've got going on here. The existing question, the existing structures was one with the existing building code.
Right.
And the other, which is with the IBC, how do we calculate the occupant load?
Yeah.
So, I do see what you said. I did have the, on page 5 there at the very top, I did have the word design, occupant load, hoping for that intent. You mentioned that you did like that language from the 2015, the load equivalent to or greater than the number of students in which the facility was designed for. That language is still included on page 4 there under 423.4, Group E occupancies. So one section prior or the header section of this. That may be enough there, otherwise, you know, at the moment, I mean, I might propose here to the board that we add, like I said, page 5 there at the top again, instead of just design off the load, perhaps we just say the total student and faculty design load, to kind of hark, you know, back on that original sentence and tie the two in, and maybe that will cover it enough with your concerns.
Question on that. What happens if you have it designed? You're always gonna get more students, right? Or you could potentially get classrooms that end up with more students than what they were designed for, then those students aren't accounted for. So how do you
This is-
propose?
So
It's
that-
part of our concern
Yes.
too.
Yeah.
From the city standpoint, because, yeah, you know, a lot of these schools are overwhelmed at the moment. They're
Right.
building new ones left and right. Mustang especially is one of the worst, but, you know, on our end, you know, being the authority having jurisdiction, you know, we're gonna require either engineer or architect stamped, you know,
Sure.
design, you know, showing that design document load, you know, the maximum enrollment count, things like that, and that's really about all we can do. You know, I don't know that there's nothing that I could think of that would ever completely safeguard it.
Right, but you don't ever have to get updated student population counts either, so
No,
if they
but
were
every-
designed for this,
every
and then the
time.
next year they've added
Yeah.
200 kids, just because they technically have the room to put them in classrooms, what happens to those 200 kiddos that aren't accounted for a storm shelter?
Sure, but, so we're talking about, most of the schools have in the range of, you know, 50 classrooms, you know, so 200 kids is 4 extra kids per classroom, so in theory, that would take it from 25 to 29. What we're talking about is finding that max occupancy, and we've even talked about with the OUBCC, Marcia has, of having the districts issue a letter saying, this is the max occupancy we would like for the school. That way there's some
Would that-
guarantee.
Would that be required to be updated yearly to make sure it doesn't exceed the max occupancy, so that you have the requirements met?
I think there's definitely conversations there to talk about and look at. I don't wanna speak necessarily for the school districts,
Right.
all within Oklahoma City jurisdiction, but I think they would all be open to that, because I think they would all tell you, there's no way we're putting 42 kids in a classroom.
Right, and I agree, cause that's crammed in, but in the other side is technically code would allow you to, right? Technically, I'm not saying that that's what you wanna do, so then if they allow you to, then technically, those kids, if you were to take advantage of that aspect of the code, would not be covered. Those additional 10 kids or 5 kids wouldn't be covered in a storm shelter, as far as like the max occupancy of a storm shelter. Now, if there's a storm, you're putting them all in there no matter what.
Right.
Right?
Right.
But there really isn't, you know,
Well, and there is a safety factor, that's kind of a part of the discussion we've talked about, there's a safety factor built into the 5 square feet per kid or per
Right.
occupant in a storm shelter. And now we're talking about, let's also put a safety factor in the number of kids we're gonna have on the classrooms, and that we're gonna build a shelter for. So we're kind of doubling up, trying to make it, you know, trying to make sure we're covering for those overages.
Right.
That might occur.
but as of right now, for like what we're talking about right now, there's nothing in place that says there's a max design for this school. And so therefore, and it'll be updated to never exceed that, and so right now, it would be on good faith to say, hey, you're designing it for 2,500 kids, but we have nothing to say that you're not really putting 2,700 in there for
Well,
any school.
So for any assembly space, you're probably aware, there's posted sign limits for
Right.
just assembly
That's assembly.
spaces anyway. I mean, we could do the same thing for schools and say, max, you know, we could post a sign that says, max enrollment or max occupancy of this school is X. And that would kind of say to everybody, so that everybody can see that this is the most we're ever gonna put in. And I'm not saying we're solving the problem
No,
today
I'm not.
by any means. I think these are all great discussions to have, and I think there's a solution to move forward with. We just have to find that right solution. And that's what I'm saying, is that's why I wanted to have this discussion, because I think we're all kind of similar mindsets, that we're not gonna have 42 kids in every single classroom in a school. So, imperfect attendance is a great point.
And, you know, I mean, for the standpoint of the jurisdiction, you know, there's no policing of these numbers that we could ever possibly do.
Right.
You know, so, you know, that's why I say when, you know, as the AHA, we're gonna be requiring, you know, that engineer architect stamped, and then sealed document with that occupant load on it, the design occupant load. That's all we're gonna have to go off of. It's gonna throw the liability back on the school. But to your concern, yeah, there would never be any true policing We can post signs and do all sorts of things, but, there's never gonna be anybody that's truly gonna be able to go out there and verify it through the year. Every time they get a permit, we would update that, we would require that, stamped document to be validated again, but, realistically, yes, there's no possible way to truly limit, the number of students to a number we decide.
So one of the things that's also coming up, or coming to light, is Marcia being on the OKCPS. She's seeing advanced copies of the 2024 code coming out from IDC, and they're actually using that language to start allowing for some flexibility, which tells me they're starting to realize that they are currently requiring storm shelters to be able to design. So this is actually from the commentary for the code, and you can see they were talking about storm shelters here, and they say, but fire existing total occupant load, which is egress, is excessive for storm shelter design. Like, they're starting to recognize that that is an issue. The current 2024 code is starting to see under exception 1, they're starting to put this language in, where approved by the building official, the actual number of occupants for whom each occupied space for a building is designed, although less than that determined by occupant code load calculation, shall be permitted to be used. So they're starting to say, hey, we're gonna start giving that flexibility back to the code officials so that they can have those reasonable discussions with the school districts, because right now, I think everybody, including the national group, is starting to understand that egress code for storm shelters is excessive.
Is how student enrollment comes into play. Do you turn students away? I presume there's a number where you say, sorry, we can't have you.
Is that a question for the, so
Yeah.
one, we don't turn students away. I mean, we are not able to do that, not that we would if we could. So from a public school standpoint, no, that's not an option. But, right now, I should have brought with me, like, where we're at from a capacity standpoint, but even preceding what we did with our bond authorization, if you go back to Pathway to Greatness, where we were at was about 63% as far as utilization of our buildings. And so we constantly monitor our buildings as far as available seats in our buildings. There's an open transfer rule. So if there are available seats, students can move from one school to the other. And you made a great point as far as just attendance. Our attendance is roughly, 90% on any given day as far as students are concerned. But then also the impact as far as classrooms, I just would throw in there is also you have what we call the Office of Exceptional Students, students with disabilities, that we also have those classrooms, even though they're in a classroom that can hold 30 students, they would be maxed at 10, or whatever those federal requirements would be for those students. Same thing with our English language development students. We have them in a much smaller classroom, just from an instructional standpoint. So, but yes, we constantly have to post on our website what our student enrollment is school by school, where there are available seats.
Does that percentage come into play when you're saying there's 10 instead of 25 or 42? Does that come into play on your percentage that you listed in terms of how much the school is occupied?
You're asking about what that percentage is compared to code occupancy or to actual occupancy, because their numbers are not code occupancy that they're comparing.
So if you're saying you got a special classroom with 10, but you have 6 in it, then that's 60% occupant for that classroom, even though architectural side, IBC side might say there's 42.
Yes. Yeah, because if the student would be designed for more students, or even certainly from a code standpoint, as far as egress, it could be designed for 42, or it could hold 42 students, but it would be at 6.
Well, what you're asking is just, when they're looking at the code, when they're looking at how full they are, like if there's 60% capacity, they're not looking at 60% of the 4,000 capacity. They're looking at 60% of what they can actually serve in that building.
Right, and everything is driven by staffing ratio, so kind of the Keith's point, he was earlier talking about what we try to achieve. So we have a preferred staffing capacity. We're actually trying to keep that more than 25. From a secondary or elementary school, it varies, but it may be anywhere from 18 to 21. Even though, again, the class sizes are designed to hold more than that, we're striving from that academic standpoint, instruction standpoint, to keep that much lower.
So when we were going through bond planning for this, and we haven't, I can show you the spreadsheets, I've got them all on my laptop, but when we were looking at what target occupancy do we want to have for X school, if it was 500, we were actually using 21 at elementary schools, and we're using 18 at high schools to set the classroom count. We didn't know, obviously, that the punitive side of that from the storm shelter, because our storm shelters get so big at the time, we were thinking that we still had the ability to do some kind of design occupancy because of the way the 2015 language was written. And so when we were thinking that through, we were looking at, okay, we're gonna house 500 students in this school. We're gonna build a storm shelter for slightly over that. Knowing that, you know, we are going to get that fluctuation, trying to do our best to account. Like, no school ever wants to be in a situation where they'll put all the students in a storm shelter. To that point, at Northwest Classen High School, the addition that we're putting on, it actually has a storm shelter sized for the actual occupancy of that school. We're only required to have, and I forget the number right now, I think we were trying to pick up 16 times, somewhere in the neighborhood of like 500 more kids through capacity, but we sized it so we could actually fit the entire school in that, because we do not want to get in a situation where we've got a storm shelter at a school that sizes just for the addition and can't handle full occupancy of the school. So they actually have already shown that they're going above and beyond in that regard, because the direction from the district was, no, we want to have a shelter so we can get all of our actual students and faculty in.
Scott, I got a question. So, given the fact that we're where we are with regard to the code going to council, what's our goal here?
Well, so currently, all the codes we had previously approved, getting final approval on, obviously, on EDC and the IFC. Susan Randall and her staff are, and legal are actually looking them over right now. This is kind of an emergency hearing to see if we want to approve any last minute changes to the IPC and the IEBC. You know, I think we would need to have an official proposal. If you have exact language you want to propose, we'd have to take the votes on it real quick. If they are turned down, then I think we'd be sticking with the language that was previously approved.
Do we have any idea what Mike's that group's gonna say about it? Since the fire marshals, because they gave us, you know, the directions to go on all of the fire issues that we had to move in from 21 anyway. So I'm just curious about what their standpoint is, because they're the biggest obstacle, I think, really.
Well, fires, I haven't spoken with fire about this because it didn't involve the IFC or any fire-related issues. So yeah, I don't know their.
Well, it's egress, so, and they had a big deal about egress, so I don't know that it extends to the storm shelters or not. I would assume they kind of go hand in hand, but.
Well, on this, we're not affecting means of egress nor the means of egress occupant load though.
Right.
All of the design standards are still in place. Well, like I said, this discussion, you know, at least so far is really only, you know, in terms of what occupant load are we going to apply to the shelter itself. Are we going to use the entire occupant load for means of egress, you know, 3,000, 4,000, whatever it may be, or, you know, the design occupant load for enrollment? That's really where we're at on this. So yeah, I didn't include fire on that. I don't think that's in there.
And so that thought process would apply to both the IUC and the IBC.
Yeah.
I guess my point here would be, thank you for the presentation, but we really need to have your recommended language changed. We can't take action on that today, my feeling. We'll have to reconvene.
Yeah, we can reconvene. Otherwise, it's a little bit ad hoc. I don't know if we can propose any language while we're here.
Because there also could be maybe a medium place where it's not necessarily the design occupancy, but it's like 1.2% of the design occupancy to add a little buffer for larger classroom. Yeah, or something.
I was wondering about that, a percentage change, although I kind of, when you were talking, I was thinking that doesn't mean, you know, they have 30 additional students this year, and then they have 30 additional students the next year, and then they have 30 additional students the next year.
That's my concern.
Right.
But I also understand you don't want to cram that many in.
Absolutely.
But sometimes they can't turn students down either, public schools, so what do you do?
Yeah, that's the happy medium.
Yeah.
So,
for the state committee, one proposed change that I'm personally submitting is to actually add 10% onto that.
And that's kind of, yeah, what I was saying, I said 20, but yeah, some
I originally actually
number.
started at 20,
Yeah.
and if I went down to 15, I was like, well, that might be a bit much still, so.
Something, because that would give a little bit of leeway.
The other thing to think about too is when you come up, whatever the occupant count is, it's a net area of 5 square foot per person. And I think what 200, you do 10 square foot for disability. You're not going to exactly match that number, right? So I mean, there's going to be some natural extra space once you size that classroom. You know, if you do the 10% over. So I just, you know, there's some inherent conservatism in how you go about developing plans. And it's, you know, really, I think, I can speak for Oklahoma City District that they're going to be very responsible for maintaining their population. I think anybody that is giving, you know, the design team a number that they need to design for, they're doing it with the right intent. So I feel like there's some built-in conservatism, and you'll get that 10%, have some overage and some growth. And if you're the numbers that you're talking about, assembly on some of these, assembly's driving the number, not the enrollment, right?
Yeah, Capitol
I mean,
Hill.
most of your examples, it's the assembly.
Well, at Capitol Hill, the assembly would actually be the control factor, which is much bigger than the school.
Yes, which was what, 3,400, and they were putting some extra in for maybe 2,500 or 600, I think, right, for the E calculation. It was more if you took the actual egress.
I think that would have to be factored in too, because if they were actually to hold an assembly use there, not just for the students, but for outside,
Yeah, it's not
outside
a
guests, because they do that at Classen and various things like that. You'd have to be able to account for that as well.
And that's
And
what
that
the
is-
code, that's actually what the code says. It says, right now, education, or assembly, indoor assembly, whichever is largest.
Right.
So, in this case, like the Capitol Hill case, the assembly space is actually larger than the school, so that would be.
So you're not asking for that example to be driven by the educational
No, that
design?
is.
No,
Okay,
that is what
okay.
it is.
And it's still lower than the egress occupancy of,
Education.
for the education side, yeah.
I mean, I think the intent is always, we hope the intent is always positive, but at the end of the day, on something like this, and we get 10 years down the road and a school is added up to whatever code would be, and then we're the ones sitting here saying we made the decision to do this. So intent is not in question, but I think we have to get black and white wording on what's gonna be the most protective for students moving forward, and not relying on like the intent of the designer.
Right, and I think, again, we definitely want to find a way to define that.
Sure.
And, you know, we keep talking about that middle ground, have it, like, the school district, like I said, was sizing for 21 and 18, but we know they're gonna have more than that. And so whether it's 25 or 30, you know, in that 830 square foot classroom, like, we're happy to have that discussion.
Yeah.
That's still 12 kids less than what code will take.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I see what you guys are saying. I mean, it makes sense, but yeah, I think we still, going back to what Tim said, we need something to approve, language, black and white.
Not to put Ms. Randall on the spot, how far along are we?
I think we've pretty much gone through most of them. There's another attorney in my office, Stephen Barker, who's been working on them. I've been in trial all week, so, he has gotten quite, I think, reviewed them, and we were gonna go back and meet with Scott and go over some, questions that he had.
So everything would be more or less on hold depending on the outcome of this meeting or next one?
Right.
Okay, so.
The goal was, time-wise, we were trying to get this done by the end of the year.
That was the goal. Hopefully we can still get close to it. That's gonna be the board's purview today. I did have one proposed section of changed language there, page 18 in the existing building code. Because it sounded like from the discussion, we might need to change something in the language proposed for the IBC, but I didn't know if we wanted to discuss this and possibly vote on it.
Change of use?
Yes,
I have a
page
comment.
18, the change of use.
I have a comment on that. So, at John Marshall, your example, if you're taking 1,000 square foot of the business admin and you're changing it to 1,000 square foot of education, you're flip-flopping it, right? It's about the same square footage. But in an instance where you were to take maybe 3,000 square feet of business, what was business occupancy, and change it to education and cram it into like 1,000, so you're adding a net gain of 2,000 square foot of education.
Right.
To me, that's adding a lot more students than what just flipping, you know, the location of the occupancy, like, does that make sense? So the change of use, to me, if it's similar in square footage, doesn't bother me as much as if you're changing the use and you're increasing the number of students or population in the building.
The only way where I could see that ever happening is if we were to take a basketball gym and say, okay, we're gonna convert this to classrooms.
They've done that in the past. Schools have done that in the past, taken gyms and converted them to classrooms.
Right.
So, so that's my concern with the change of use. I'm not saying that, you know, triggering a storm shelter, I would love storm shelters everywhere. We all want them, right? I don't have as much hardship if I'm just flipping the admin into education. I have a lot more hardship if I'm taking and adding a lot more education, because I took a big area that was business and now I'm putting a lot more education and I'm reducing it just so I could get more classrooms, and now I don't have, you know. So that's where my concerns lie more with the change of use,
Okay.
is the square footage comparisons.
With the gym fee,
Because then it's kind of like adding an education.
Yeah.
so we'll get assembly space,
if
which
you-
will be a higher number than the number of students in the classroom.
Yeah, but I'm just,
But
like
in
if
that
you're adding.
instance, you're not changing the enrollment.
Right.
The example that was presented, there's no change in actual enrollment.
Right.
All you're doing is you've got two buildings that are constructed similarly, you're just swapping the space for the function of the school. You're actually providing safer security. And if we have to do a shelter, then maybe it limits the project, and, you know, in theory, kids aren't safe.
And I'm not questioning that, Larry, I was just bringing up more the, if they were to change those uses and they were changing it to an area that they had a lot more business or something
But I
before.
would think.
Cause then that would be an increase in education, that'd be an increase in kids if they were to
Sure.
take, you know, that's what.
There's no stipulation in square footage.
Yes,
or
that's
what-
more what I'm saying, is like
So-
just
That's the root of it.
Well, and that comes into the categorization in the IEBC of whether it's an alteration or, and I forget, alteration 1, 2, 3.
Level 1,
Yeah,
2, 3.
so maybe we could tie it to something there, because the higher level of alteration, you know,
Sure.
might be worth looking at. And that could also fall into kind of that example of if somebody's renovating an existing business occupancy, like a mall or something,
Right.
into a school, that has a much higher level of alteration as well, so maybe we can tie it to that somehow.
Yeah, I think something in between that would work. 'Cause I
Yeah.
agree 100% with yours, and I agree 100% with your project, so we've got to find something in the middle that
Sure.
works.
Yeah,
Your
I'm talking about
situation is,
future
yeah.
projects with
Oh, yeah.
any district that, you
Yeah.
know, if that's what my concern is, that's not taking 1,000 here and 1,000 and just moving where they are, 'cause that's
Right.
better for the school.
Yeah.
I'm not questioning that,
And
it's more,
And I would say that, you know, if any language that we propose, probably should have just a little bit of leeway, because code will tell you, like, you're never gonna get an exact swap.
no.
But-
Yeah, you're not gonna get 1,000 for 1,000, you're
Right.
never gonna find that in an existing building.
Right.
If I may, you know, one example of this, kind of a loophole in the current code, you know, current 2015 code supplement with Oklahoma City, it requires storm shelter for new construction. It does not currently require it for change of use, that's why we're
Right.
having this language. So with that, you know, if, you know, a school brought in a modular classroom for e-use, but instead used it as business, you know, moved the business section out into the modular classroom and converted the indoor business to an e-use, you're gaining that student enrollment without having to technically do put in a storm shelter under the 2015. You know,
Right.
So that's kind of leading toward your concern, is like, yeah, you know, you're increasing that risk there, adding more students, so, yeah, we have to find some language around that. I kind of agree with your idea perhaps about the alteration 1, 2, or 3, just find the proper language for it, so.
Right.
With that discussion, I do see a little bit more of a flaw even with what I've written here on page 18, so. I don't know if I wanna ask what the purview of the board is here, if you guys wanna shelve that or vote on it, or what you wanna do.
It'd be my preference to bring it back with the other changes and put through all the changes together. If we have the time.
So it's like school and Crossroads Mall.
Yeah, right.
I guess the IEBC section 1011.8, and the other one was the IBC, section 423. Updated language. We still have the question of the adult changing tables. I know we have some guests here who want to speak about that in a moment, but I don't know if you guys wanted to have any type of vote to put that, to continue those other items.
Yeah, if it needs an action, I'll be open to a motion.
Will that trigger us building a space, a public restroom? And that's just open, like, I don't know what the intent was, so it might be just a question from that standpoint. And maybe we can clarify that as well. And if it is, that's fine, like, we'll address it. If it's not, then, again, just wanted to understand what the goal was.
Yeah, I don't think that that's been completely addressed in the current language that we had previously adopted. We had two exceptions. The first one there under 1109.16.1, it's actually on page 8. The very top of page 8, exception 1 and 2 there. This is where a building is provided with more than one family or assisted use toilet and bathing room. Only one such room should be required at a universal changing station. That's typical in line with the rest of the building code. Where this exception is utilized, signs should be provided, et cetera, et cetera. Number 2 there, that somewhat gets at what you're talking about. Existing structures are permitted to comply with this section to the greatest extent feasible, as allowed for the 2018 International Existing Building Code. The current language in that was adopted was to allow some understanding of historical buildings, structural elements that are in the way, or certain infeasibilities that do creep up on occasion, columns that can't be moved, designs that can't be changed. There could perhaps be additional language added there to better specify, such as you mentioned earlier, the level of alteration 1, 2, or 3, those kind of limits, those are scopes. But yeah, I think we probably want some proposed language for the board, obviously, before we get to that, I imagine. I just want to make that point before we continue. Okay.
Anybody else from the public want to speak? Thank you for participating. At this point, I guess we're not taking action under the new business. We're going to ask that the school representation send language to you, and then we'll reconvene as soon as we possibly reconvene.
So I'll begin with the board members. Everybody in this room on this meeting will be updated as far as the next possible hearing date once we can figure out time and schedule. So,
any other business?
none on that part. Anything from the public?
Take a motion to adjourn.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you, everybody.